Hello and welcome to the Intern Tutor Training 2020 podcast presented to you by the South African Pharmacy Council. I hope you enjoy the presentation and at the end learn something that will make your internship a fruitful learning experience. Before we begin the podcast, I'd like to outline what would be covered. Firstly, we'll be looking at the CPD cycle, and this involves selecting an appropriate domain based on your learning need. Secondly, selecting a competency standard, also in line with what your learning need is all about. Considering the pitfalls and the special considerations, outlining what evidence entails and what is important based on the requirements of the South African Pharmacy Council guidelines, what is the assessment process and particularly the reassessment process, and lastly, looking at professionalism. So what are the important resources you need to have at hand before you begin the process? Firstly, you need your 2020 Intern and Tutor Manual, which is available online on the Pharmacy Council website. This particular manual should actually be your essential, or is the essential resource that you need to have at hand before you begin the process. Ideally, you should read the manual in order to gain insight into what exactly is required of the CPD cycle, and also provides insight into the pre-registration exam. Important resources within this manual that I suggest that you highlight is on page 29, the criteria for assessment of a CPD entry. This gives you insight into what is the mark breakdown that the assessors and moderators use in order to deem you as competent. Secondly is the checklist for the CPD portfolio, which is on page 33. This checklist provides you with the ideal questions you need to be asking yourself as you progress through the CPD. And lastly, your competency standards for the pharmacist, which is on page 52, which provides all of the competency standards that you require. Other resources that you should have access to is your tutor, who has a wealth of knowledge and is available to answer all of your questions, and also the Pharmacy Council website. So let's look at what the CPD is all about. The CPDs have been published by Pharmacy Council in 2018 in line with the current BPharm qualifications and the 2012 International Pharmaceutical Federation Global Competency Framework, which encompasses the changes and developments in all sectors of pharmacy and practice, including new technologies, work processes, changes in legislation, and international trends, primarily to ensure public safety. These competency standards will be used in the pre-registration exam and the portfolio to evaluate the competency of interns. If you look on page 13 of your manual, there's a detailed summary of domains and competencies that will help you or will guide you through which domain and which competency standard would be ideal for you in terms of your learning need, which we'll discuss a little bit more in detail later on. So looking at the competency framework, the competency framework consists of 6 domains and a number of competencies, and as indicated on page 13 of the Intern manual. So if you look on page 13, you'll see the 6 domains highlighted on the left of the table. There is public health, safe and rational use of medicines and medical devices, supply of medicines and medical devices, organization and management skills, professional and personal practice, and lastly, domain 6, which is education, research, and critical analysis. So please make sure you understand all of those domains. And in order to progress with your CPD, you need to understand where your learning need actually falls in. So let's look at the competency framework in detail. So page 52, 53 of your intern manual details out all the domains and gives you the competency standard. So if we look at what each of the domains contain. So if you look at, for example, domain 1, which is your public health domain, it has a competency standard and below that it has a behavioral statement. So on page 52 of your manual, if you look at domain 1.1 is promotion of health and wellness, and that is your competency standard. So your competency standard selected would be promotion of health and wellness. Below that, you would have behaviors, which is A, B, C, D. And in 1.1, you have 4 behaviors that you need to cover. So each competency standard would have behavioral statements that you would have to fulfill in order to deem yourself competent. So if you look at the framework again, it contains a domain where we have 6 domains which you need to complete. You have to choose a competency standard within that domain. And furthermore, you have to fulfill all of the behavioral statements underneath those competency standards. So looking at the 6 domains again, as I've said, they are public health, safe and rational use of medicines and medical devices, etc. You have to be, in order to deem yourself as competent, you have to complete all of the 6 domains. You have to choose one competency standard and fulfill all of the behavioral statements within those competency standards in order to deem yourself as being competent. So domains are organized clusters of competencies. So detailing it out again in terms of an example, domain 5, which is your professional and personal practice. Here you'd have competency standard 5.1, which is your patient-centered care, and another example 5.2, which is professional practice. Within competency standard 5.1, which is patient-centered care, you would have behavioral statements A, B, and C, while competency standard 5.2 would have behavioral statements starting from A and going all the way up to G. Now, depending on your learning need, you would have to decide which competency standard suits your learning need. Now, these competency standards were developed and are in line with the current practice of exit level outcomes based on the BPharm qualification and international trends. Not to confuse you too much, but if you are out of interest, if you are keen on knowing what the exit level outcomes are, they are available on page 9 of your manual. The competency standards have been developed with behavioral statements linked to each competency, which I've said already. These behavioral statements can also be called subsections. So for those of you who are currently registered as 2020 interns, you would have to follow the competency standards and the behavioral statements based on the 2020 system. However, if you were registered in 2019, you would have to fulfill the 2019 format. So in order to understand what a competency standard entails, you need to understand what the CPD is all about. What does it look like in terms of its structure? So the first part is the domain. Now, if you look on page 54 of your manual, for example, on domain on public health, if you look at the structure of it, the very first component or the very first thing is number 1, which says domain 1, which is public health. Underneath that is, does this domain apply to me? And that's a very important question you need to ask yourself. How does it apply to you? So you know already that you have to do all 6 domains. So what you need to do is to be able to find out which of the competencies apply to your learning need. So reading, does this domain apply to me, is very important. Although you need to do it, you still need to understand what the domain is all about. Public health provides a detailed description. Thereafter, you have the introduction to that domain, which is also very important for you to read and gain more knowledge as to what the domain is all about. Thereafter, it follows with the competencies, which is 1.1, promotion of health. And in terms of domain, it goes all the way from 1.1 right up until 1.5. 1.6 of your manual on page 56. So it's quite a comprehensive domain, and you're able to choose from 6 different competencies, and therefore gives you many options. Thereafter, it's followed by your behavioral statements. And the behavioral statements define numbers based on the competencies. Now, in terms of entry level, that is based on whether you're an intern, whether you are a newly qualified pharmacist, or a pharmacist that's been practicing for many years. But for now, all you would focus on is entry-level pharmacists, and that applies to interns. And at the end of the competencies, you would see an assessment tick box, which is just a guide. So on this slide, it provides you an example of what the structure of the competency standards are, and I've discussed this already with you. So why is it important that you do a CPD? In essence, what a CPD is if one wants to reach their full potential in any industry, be it in regulatory, be it in community pharmacy, in hospital pharmacy, in warehousing, distribution, whichever industry that you are situated in, irrespective of where you are in your career as an intern or as a qualified pharmacist, you have to commit yourself to ongoing development and embracing every opportunity to grow and to evolve. And that's what, in essence, what a CPD is all about. So getting into the theory behind continuing professional development, or CPD, the definition is the process by which registered persons maintain and enhance their competence throughout their professional careers. It encompasses a range of activities, including continuing education and supplementary training. It enables registered persons to develop in their area of practice and to demonstrate competence. CPD is a cyclical activity, and we will discuss this further now. So the CPD cycle has 4 major areas, and in order to understand how you approach or how you would do a CPD, you have to understand what goes into each of those areas within a CPD cycle. The very first process is your reflection. Now, what I'd like you to do is to look on page 25 of your manual, and you'll see it provides information on what the CPD cycle process is all about. The very first step is step 1, which is your reflection on your practice. Now, the questions you need to ask here is, what do I need to know in terms of your practice? What do I need to be able to do in terms of your reflection? Furthermore, if you look at your assessment criteria, which is on page 29, it gives you a clear guide as to what assessors and moderators are looking for in order to deem you as competent in each of the processes of the CPD cycle. So if you look on page 29, it gives you the information that you require. So in order to get a 3 in reflection, you must be able to have a clear learning need. So you must explain what happened that triggered the learning need, an indication of what the intern hopes to achieve after completion of the outcome. Now, if you detailed out exactly what's been triggered in order for you to fulfill this learning need, and how you expect to achieve this, you will achieve full 3 marks. So it's very important that when you're writing your CPD, you use the resources available in your intern manual. So on page 29, which details out exactly what the mark breakdown is, and also on page 25, which describes what each process is. So I'm reiterating, reflection is, what do I need to know? And what do I need to be able to do that? So in terms of your reflection, it determines the choice of competency that you would choose and the behavioral statements that come with them. So again, what do I need to learn? So let me give you an example. Say, for example, that we are talking about what's topical at the moment in terms of COVID-19. So your question you would ask, you've identified that probably you don't have enough information or knowledge about COVID-19. So you've identified, what do I need to learn? So what triggered that learning? You'd have to explain that potentially you were curious as to what COVID-19 is because it's important as a professional or healthcare professional that you need to understand what COVID-19 is all about. Secondly, how do I know that that's what I need to learn? Maybe you had a patient that came into the pharmacy, maybe you want to provide a public health program on that, or generally that you're just concerned as a healthcare professional. So you need to explain, what do I need to learn and how do I know that that's what I need to learn? And you would explain that based on the information or the trigger that brought you to that learning need. For example, COVID-19. Or if you want to look at something else, for example, the new scheduling changes that has occurred on by SAPRA in terms of the Medicines Related Substance Act. You can even discuss how that has impacted your practice and how you need to know what the new scheduling status is based on the fact that you work in a community pharmacy and it impacts your sales. So now that you've identified what you need to learn, you'd have to go through all of the domains and have a look at which domain suits that particular learning need, and furthermore, identify the competency and the behavioral statements that align to that particular learning need. Once you identify that, then you are able to continue with the CPD. Importantly, within the reflection process or the reflection step, is that you must be able to provide a title to your learning need, and the title must be relevant to that particular learning need. It should not be a copy and paste of what the domain is or the competency is. And basically, this entire process or the exercise of reflection is for you to be able to identify what you learned and what your trigger is and what you need to learn, and therefore it's important that you use I all the time when you are writing. So I've already explained in terms of what you need to learn. What do I need to learn? Own your learning need. How do I know that that's what I need to learn? Learning title I've explained, and using the pronoun I. Now, if you recall at the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned to you the checklist for CPD portfolio, which was on page 33. This is a snapshot of what the reflection tick list is, and as you can see, it gives you a further guide. Other than just the assessment criteria on page 29, the tick list also further iterates what you need to do in terms of your CPD. So there's many tools in your manual that you can use to ensure that you fulfill the requirements of what is needed in terms of each of the processes, and make sure that you get your full 3 marks in order to pass. So just have a look at this quickly. It gives you a checklist as to whether there's a title. Is the title short, specific, and related to the outcome? If you look at the reflection, we talked about I need to know or need to learn. Have I stated my learning need in the first person, so using I, etc. So it's a very, very important tool, and make sure you make use of this. The second step is your planning. Just as with any task that you do on a daily basis, your planning is crucial in order to achieve success. So here in the planning process, what you need to ask yourself is, how can I learn this? What is the process that I need to fulfill in order to plan properly to achieve my learning need? Here you would use your behavioral statements to guide your planning. So for example, if you look at domain 1 and if you look at competency standard 1, so competency 1.1 says promotion of health and wellness. Now, if you look at that particular competency, you would want to have a look at your behavioral statements in order to guide your planning. So if you have chosen 1.1, it says provide advice on health promotion, provide advice on disease prevention and control, provide advice on healthy lifestyles, and participate in public health campaigns. So in order to achieve this particular competency, what would you need in terms of your planning in order to achieve that? So it's very important that you use your behavioral statements as a guide. So this particular section in terms of planning, make sure that you provide the appropriate resources. For example, if you are looking at the Medicines Related Substance Act, you would provide that as a planning resource. If you're looking at the ethical rules, or if you're looking at, say for instance, the SAMP, in terms of a clinical case, you would provide the SAMP, the exact pages of that in terms of an ideal resource. You need to also make sure that you provide important reasons for planning it this way. And why did you include those particular resources? So why did you include the SAMP? And why did you include the Medicines Related Substance Act? How did it align to your behavioral statements? Now I'll take you back to page 29 of your manual. And if you look at the assessment criteria again on planning, in order to deem yourself as competent and achieve a full 3 marks, you need to provide a detailed plan which includes your resources, structured according to the outcomes of the behaviors, and the reasoning behind why that planning was included. And I say it again, often this area is poorly answered as interns forget to include why they are using that particular resource. So make sure you explain the reasoning or the thought processes behind using that particular resource and align it to your behavioral statements, which makes it much easier and clearer for the assessor to understand. So just a brief overview of what planning is. How exactly am I going to learn this? So how would you learn about, for example, COVID-19? How would you learn about the new changes in terms of your scheduling statuses? What are my options? You could be looking at short courses, workshops, online reading, journal articles. When will you be doing this? What evidence can you submit to support your learning activity? So it must be a it must be a structured plan in order to identify your thought processes as to how you're going to achieve this particular competency. So looking at the tick list, again, provides a detailed explanation of the questions that you need to ask yourself as you go through the planning section. Have I clearly stated how I'm going to learn? Have I identified the resources? Have I explained how I'm going to be using these resources? Have I made sure not to just write what I intend to do, which usually goes into implementation. So be very careful of that. Often interns confuse implementation and planning and write the implementation section into planning. So your planning purely looks at how am I going to learn. So what is your plan behind being able to fulfill this particular competency? And have I written in the future tense? So tense is really important. The third step within the CPD cycle is your implementation. Now, implementation is very, very important because it incorporates your evidence. So here it's quite simple, and all it states is that you have to explain what have I done. So what were the steps that were taken in order to achieve this particular competency? So this competency is requiring you to describe exactly what you have done. You must make sure that you cover within the context of implementation. What have you done? When did you do it? Where did you do it? And how did you do it? So if we look at the example of COVID-19, which is very topical. So in the implementation process, if you're looking at gathering information on COVID-19, what did you do? So what was part of your planning process in order to obtain information on COVID-19? What resources did you look for? Did you look online? Did you search for scientific journals? Did you go to the World Health Organization, and why? Did you go to the CDC, and why? In terms of their websites. What are the other resources that you used? Maybe you learned information from the South African Pharmacy Journal, or you looked at modern pharmacy, for example, or you found an interesting article on Business Insider and searched for more information on that. So you have to detail out exactly what you did in your implementation. When did you do this? This could be during free time that you had, where you were able to read the information, where you were able to find the time in order to access those resources. Where did you do it? So in terms of the sites that you used, did you go on to the CDC and World Health Organization and Lancet, for example? Did you read all of the multiple articles that were published in the Lancet journal on COVID-19? Or did you access your information on, for example, the South African Pharmacy Journal, which you had a hard copy of in your pharmacy? Or maybe perhaps you spoke to your tutor who provided more information for you. How did you do this? You, as we mentioned already, accessed the internet, but you also summarized all of that information that you accessed. You were able to maybe produce pamphlets, depending on what the behavioral statements requires you to do for this particular competency. So you have to make sure on the implementation that you answer what, when, where, and how. Now, critical to the implementation is linking all of this to the evidence. So if you look at your competence and your behavioral statements, make sure that your behavioral statements are linked to the evidence that you provide. Very, very critical, and we'll discuss this a bit later, but very, very important is that you annotate your evidence and link it to your behavioral statements. Remember to include all the behavioral statements of the chosen outcome in your implementation. So in your implementation, the expectation from the assessors and the moderators is that you would say, for example, domain 1, and you chose competency standard 1.1 and behavioral statements A to D. So within your implementation, the assessors and the moderators would like to see 1.1A, 1.1B, 1.1C, 1.1D, and link this all to the evidence by annotating the evidence and linking it to 1.1A, 1.1B, etc. Often one of the problems of implementation is that the linking to the evidence is lacking, and interns usually fail this particular portion of the CPD cycle. So be very careful when it comes to implementation. Make sure that you tell the story and you keep using I. The checklist again, very important to guide you. So again, it says, have I included where, when, what, and how? What did I do? Write in the past tense. Make sure that you're labeling all of your evidence based on the behavioral statements. And how does this match my learning need? Are you covering exactly what you needed to do as you stated out in your learning title? Importantly is that, again, to reiterate, the implementation must be supported by evidence that is sufficient, that is relevant, that is current, and that is valid, which we'll detail out a bit later. Often the make or break in terms of passing your CPD is based on your evidence, and if your evidence is poor and lacks validity and sufficiency, authenticity, then you usually fail that particular domain. Evidence is usually very poorly covered when it comes to the CPDs. So make sure as an intern you get your evidence right. Make sure that you check that it's sufficient, meaning that it covers 75% of the subsections of the behavioral statements. So 75% is very important. And you can see in the checklist, it says exactly 75% of your behavioral statements. Have you annotated your evidence? Meaning, have you labeled it clearly enough to be linking to each of the behavioral statements within your competencies? Have I annotated my evidence with the behavioral statements, as I've said already? Is the evidence clear? Is it readable? Is it loaded in the right direction? Is your evidence properly verified? Is there a name of your tutor, your P number, etc.? And have you made sure that all the patient identifying details such as name, surname, ID number have been hidden based on confidentiality issues? So make sure you cover all of that in terms of your evidence. Often what we find in terms of when we're assessing or we're moderating is that the annotation is lacking. So remember, annotation is basically highlighting to the assessor and to the moderator the important or relevant parts of that evidence that links it to your learning need. So if you can identify and make the evidence clear by annotating as to which areas in that piece of evidence is relevant to that behavioral statement, then it makes it much easier and less frustrating for the assessor or the moderator, and you're able to relay your story much more clearly. So remember to look at your criteria for assessment on page 29 of your manual, which again provides information as to how you can get a full 3 marks. So description of what, where, when, and how, and the reference made to the evidence and link to the outcomes and the behaviors. In terms of your evidence, what will deem you to get a full 3 marks is your evidence must be valid, it must be current, it must be sufficient, and it must be annotated. At least 75% of the sections or the behaviors must be linked to the description. Very, very important that you cover this. Often we find interns do not cover this, and it's a problem. So make sure that you fulfill that criteria. I will just detail out evidence a bit more later. The final step is evaluation. So in terms of the cycle, evaluation is the last step that describes what you've learned and how did you apply what you've learned in your practice on a daily basis or on a relatively regular basis. So here you would focus on the learning outcome, that is, what have you learned, and it's related to the evidence that you've provided. Application, how have you subsequently used your acquired knowledge? So in terms of the COVID example again, how did you apply the knowledge that you learned to your practice in terms of maybe providing more information to your elderly patients, because it seems to target elderly or impact elderly patients at a higher rate compared to younger. So that type of information. What is the impact? So how was your acquired knowledge impactful to your current practice? How did it change your practice? Did you find that because of the information that you provided, your patients came to you more regularly for advice, etc.? And identify further learning needs. Have you identified a gap in your knowledge in terms of public health issues, or have you identified information on how you need to learn more about disaster management, for example. It is not an area of what you did. It's purely just to look at what you've learned and how you've used that information in your practice. Very important to provide examples here of how what you've learned has impacted your daily practice. Going back to page 2930 of your intern manual, which gives you the criteria again. So there you would see, in order to gain a full 3 marks, you need to state what was learned and how the learning influenced his or her practice, way of practice, and application by means of practical or actual examples, and identifying future learning needs. The checklist further iterates what you need to do. Make sure you go through the checklist once you've completed that portion of your CPD cycle. So in essence, that's what your CPD cycle is all about: the reflection, the planning, implementation, and the evaluation. Each of the phases must be completed in detail, providing or aligning to the criteria for assessment on page 29 and 30. And make sure that you speak on a personal level, always stating I, and provide relevant examples as you go. So what is the stepwise approach to completing CPDs? So the first thing you would do is obviously identify your learning need. In this example, we're looking at COVID-19. You've identified that you needed to learn more about COVID-19, and you looked at which of the domains are suitable towards finding information on COVID-19. You've selected your domain, you've identified which domain aligns to getting information on COVID-19. Thereafter, you would look at the competency and to see which competency would align to COVID-19 and the information you wish to provide to your patient. Thereafter, you would look at what are the behavioral statements aligning to that. Start the CPD cycle, so starting off with reflection and reflecting exactly what your learning need is, planning the entire process, implementation, and then evaluation. Enter and submit online for your tutor to verify. Thereafter, the tutor verifies the CPD and submits online. Make sure your tutor has verified and submitted your entries by the deadlines published in your intern manual. If you don't, you will have problems at the end of the year in terms of registering for community service. Check for feedback from your assessors or the moderators, and make sure that you complete your annual declaration before you start the entire process. So remember, once you've chosen a competency, make sure that you check again that is appropriate to your practice setting. So ideally, if you're a community pharmacist, that particular competency must be doable or achievable within the practice setting. If it's in a regulatory environment, again, same thing applies, etc. Read all of the behavioral statements and understand what number is 75% of those behavioral statements in order to provide sufficient evidence. Very important that you do that. Make sure you understand all of those behavioral statements and how you're going to achieve that in terms of your planning as well. Decide how many you may require. So as I've said already, 75% in terms of your evidence, and also to fulfill all of those. If you have 5 behavioral statements, make sure you fulfill all of those 5 behavioral statements. As you complete each phase of the CPD cycle, make sure that you write what is relevant to the chosen outcome. So importantly that you look and you refer to your checklist and also to your assessment criteria on page 29 and 30. So in terms of the requirements, what does the requirements state in terms of how what you as an intern require in order to progress to the next phase in your career, which is community service? So here you would need to submit 6 CPD entries. Each entry must be accompanied by suitable evidence. So 6 CPD entries, meaning that you have to select one from each of the domain. As you know already, you have 6 domains that you need to fulfill. So you need to be successful in all 6 of the CPD entries. For each domain, you choose one competency. So you choose either 1.1, for example, 1.2, 1.3, etc. Just one from each of the domain. You read all of the behavioral statements carefully. You make sure that you cover all of them and provide evidence for at least 75% of that behavior, of those behavioral statements. If there are 4 or more statements, you choose at least 75%. Consult your manual for the details of the behavioral statements. So when you are fulfilling your CPDs, make sure you have your manual right next to you. Every CPD entry must reflect the individual's work. So no group activities are acceptable. Again, it outlines an example of what is required. And here we've used domain 5, professional and personal practice. You can see you have different options to choose one, but you just choose one from each domain. So if you select 5.1, which is patient-centered care, the behavioral statements A, B, C must be fulfilled. If you're selecting 5.2 from domain 5 and you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you must cover at least 6, which is from A to G. Remember to link all of your behavioral statements to your evidence. Very, very important. In the implementation phase, make sure you write it in the implementation phase and also link it to your evidence, which should be annotated based on each of the behavioral statements. So what are the requirements? Say for instance that you are an intern in the public sector hospital. How would you be able to achieve patient-initiated therapy? Here we would expect you to make arrangements at a nearest community pharmacy to achieve that particular domain. Manufacturing and academic interns may also need to do this if their 400 hours are spent in a hospital. So make sure you fulfill that requirement. So a little diversion and something for you to think about. So on a day-to-day basis, we actually fulfill the CPD cycle on a regular basis without even knowing it. So say for example, you have Granny's birthday on Sunday and you would like to serve afternoon tea for the family. A homemade cake would be very nice. So you ask yourself, maybe I could bake Granny a cake, which would make it extra special. But you ask yourself, can I actually bake that cake? And that would be part of your reflection process. I therefore need to know what kind of cake is her favorite, what ingredients to buy, and how to follow the recipe instructions. So you reflect on what cake would Granny actually like in terms of being it a vanilla or a chocolate rainbow, etc. What are the ingredients that you need to buy and how to follow the recipe instructions. So the planning would mean that you will check with your sister what cake Granny likes. Maybe she likes vanilla. You'll search online for a vanilla recipe and you'll check on YouTube for a cake making demo. Your sister will know, and that's why you ask your sister. So you have to explain in your planning process, why did you choose to ask your sister and not mom, for example? Maybe because your sister would know she does this often on an annual basis. She always bakes a cake for grandma. Why are you searching online for a recipe? Because you don't have a recipe book and because Google is accessible and you're able to achieve this very easily using YouTube, for example. Why would you use YouTube for making the cake? You can learn by watching a video online. And that's your planning process. So it's very detailed. It provides exact steps that you are taking and why you're taking those steps. The next phase in the CPD cycle is your implementation. So here you would have a look at your ingredients. So what did you do? You checked the recipe before you went shopping and made sure that you followed all of the steps in the recipe. What evidence you would provide in terms of implementation? You would definitely provide a picture of the cake that you baked and make sure that you annotate the picture. You can provide the recipe of the cake that you've used in terms of the recipe that you've Googled. You can provide pictures of the actual steps that were taken. You may be mixing the ingredients together or even standing next to the oven while the cake bakes. But make sure that you annotate all of those pictures that you provide. Pictures are not the only evidence that you provide. You have to supplement the evidence by providing the actual recipe, or even grandma eating the recipe as well would be nice. Eating the cake, sorry, would be nice. CPD evaluation. So here you would explain, if you recall, what the process is. I learned that I must follow the recipe very carefully. You learned that maybe grandma loves vanilla cake, and so did everybody else. You learned that now that you are able to make grandma's cake, now you're able to bake another cake, maybe a chocolate cake. Seems like you're going to be the family cake maker from now on because the cake that you baked was such a success. But you still need to learn how to probably make cookies because you've mastered how to make cake. Now your next step is to make cookies. So that's in essence what the CPD cycle is, and this is something that you do on a daily basis. So all you need to do is just make sure that in terms of what you do in your practice on a day-to-day basis as an intern, you conceptualize that and put it into the different phases within the CPD cycle. Okay, so let's provide a real-life example. So on the 20th of February 2020, while working in the dispensary, you received a prescription to dispense. Your tutor asked you if you know how to check if a prescription is valid and authentic. As you were unsure, this made you realize that you needed to learn this particular skill. After completing this outcome, you will hope to be able to immediately identify any anomalies on the script, or important information that was omitted from a prescription. So in terms of the reflective process, what you would ask yourself and you would reflect, what is the problem? So what is your actual learning need? You've identified that you don't actually know how to identify if this prescription is valid or authentic. And immediately your mind goes to your undergraduate teaching, and you remember that the Medicines Related Substances Act is the act that provides information on the validity and the authenticity of a prescription. And also the good pharmacy practice provides information as well. So what you would do, so your first step would be to check the competency standards in your manual and to see which of the learning needs, which of the domains, and which of the behavioral statements align to what you are trying to achieve in terms of your learning need. Now you've identified the domain 3, which talks about supply of medicine and medical devices. So when you interrogate that particular domain and competency standard and the behavioral statements, you looked at the competencies for domain 3 and decided that 3.4 medicine dispensing would be ideally suited for this type of learning need. Within 3.4, you identified 9 behavioral statements. So you realized that you need to be able to cover 7 of these to meet 75% in terms of your evidence. You saw that the next step is to formulate a learning title, which is not just a copy of the Competency 3.4. So you've identified your title, you've reflected on what you needed to do. Your next step would be your planning step. So what do you plan to do, and why am I going to do it this particular way? So remember, in terms of your planning, you need to be able to provide what are the relevant resources that you're going to be using in order to fulfill that particular learning need. So you've realized that in order to fulfill this particular learning need, the information that you require in order to validate and authenticate a particular prescription, you must be able to have a look at the information provided by the Medicines and Related Substances Act 101 of 1965, and particularly Regulation 33. So you identify and you obtain a current copy of the Medicines Related Substance Act. You would have a copy of the prescription as well as part of your evidence. And you would look for other resources on the internet. And also maybe you would even look at your good pharmacy practice. Regulation, and the reason that you choose the Medicines Related Substance Act is because of Regulation 33, which lists the particulars that needed to appear on a particular prescription in terms of validity and authentication. You have your notes from undergraduate, for example, that you may use as to add further resources to improve your learning need, and also the GPP if required. Your implementation process, remember, your implementation process requires you to describe what, where, when, and how, the reference made to the evidence, particularly in terms of annotation, and link it to the behaviors. So in this particular example, we have a script by Dr. Peter Knoll. You'll see that importantly, the patient's information is blocked out in terms of confidentiality. You check the Medicines and Related Substances Act 1965 to know what was required for a prescription to be valid and authentic. You analyze the script for any anomalies and to ensure that it met all of the legal requirements. So that identified what you did. Importantly, you must be able to link all of that behavioral statements onto your evidence by using annotations. Annotated copy of your resources is used, and then your tutor verifies as well. So in terms of the what, where, when, and how, you've identified what the resources that you need, that is the Medicines Related Substance Act. Where would you find that particular resource? If you're looking at your compendium, for example, if you're looking online, maybe on the SAPRO website, on the Pharmacy Council website, etc. When did you do it? When you had some time in terms of reading relevant information. How did you do this? You looked through the index to identify information on how to authenticate a particular script. You identified the area. You were able to read through the resource and locate how to validate and authenticate a script and provide evidence to show that. Make sure that all of the information that you provided in terms of your evidence is linked to the behavioral statements that is found within your manual. Remember also, in your planning, you must be able to show how all of your planning relates to the behavioral statements. In this example, for 3.4 medicine dispensing, it starts from A and it goes all the way to I. So be very careful that you fulfill these in order to deem yourself competent and get a full 3 marks. In terms of the implementation, you have to look at all of the statements and link it to your evidence to make sure that you fulfill and obtain full 3 marks. Here's an example of the annotated evidence. So you would include an annotated copy of the Government Gazette, Regulation 33, which provides a detailed breakdown of what exactly is required for a script to be deemed as authenticated and valid. The last step of the CPD cycle is your evaluation step. So if you look on page 30 of your intern manual, if you remember, under the evaluation step, in order to get a full 3 marks, you need to explain what was learned, how the learning influenced your way of practice, application by means of practical or actual examples, and identifying a future learning need. So here you would say, I learned that although a script may seemingly fulfill all the legal requirements, it is not necessarily authentic and valid. It is important to check all the anomalies with the prescriber based on the legal requirements as per the Medicines Related Substance Act. Identify all of the anomalies that might require communication with the prescriber. And now that you've done this, you are much more vigilant intern. You're still not quite sure, other than confirming every script with the doctor, that you will always recognize a fraudulent script. And so you need to learn more about how this is possible. So as you've completed competencies 3.4, you ask yourself, is the evidence presented to which behavioral statement, and is it linked? Include in your implementation and annotation as well. So in terms of your annotation, how is it linking to your evidence? What about the other behavioral statements, and what evidence could you use? Now that you've done or completed competency 3.4, what else do you need to do? So if you look at this particular piece of evidence, this particular evidence allows you to see that there was an anomaly that was identified on the prescription where enalapril was not the drug that was required for the patient, and it needed to be changed to losartan based on the history. Prescription was changed to losartan and dispensed, and the blue copy was provided. Now, in terms of looking at the behavioral statements within 3.4, you'll see that G says consulting prescribers regarding anomalies or potential problems, incorrect doses, or drug interactions. And that covers that particular anomaly, which is important to identify and to be able to link your evidence to that particular behavioral statement. So when you are providing evidence such as this, you must be able to say this evidence is 3.4G because it links to that particular behavioral statement. So again, annotation is purely to guide the assessor or the moderator to explain what your story is. The next example is providing evidence in terms of looking at the other behavioral statements. So if you look at medicine dispensing, providing the previous script, which looked at purely a oral dosage form, did not fulfill all of the behavioral statements within this particular competence. So in order to fulfill extemporaneous preparations, pharmaceutical calculations, you need to be able to provide a prescription that looks at that type of preparation. So this example of evidence speaks to behavioral statement E and F in your manual. So identify and annotate which behavioral statement is that particular evidence linked to. So I cannot stress enough, annotation, it is a problem in order to identify exactly what the intern is referring to when it comes to the evidence. Often we find interns are providing evidence that cannot be linked to what is said under the implementation. So ensure that what your implementation says is linked to the evidence that you provide. So annotation, what is it? It's a mechanism to give meaning to a particular evidence that is provided. It justifies why the evidence is included. It must be planned and must be meaningful and must provide links to the behavioral statements. So in essence, your annotation is almost like the pictures to a storybook. It gives you an idea of exactly what is happening and why you are saying what you're saying by providing the evidence for that. So what annotation is not? Merely labels. So you can't just label something randomly without stating how it's linked to that behavioral statement. Single words next to parts of evidence, not very clear to the assessor or the moderator what you mean by that. Scribbles on the evidence and lacking links to the behavioral statements. So make sure you do not make that mistake or those mistakes and provide a detailed explanation of what the annotation is all about for your evidence. Remember to provide 75% of the evidence, 75% of the behavioral statements must have evidence linked to it. So let's look at a common example that is used where interns provide a receipt of stock that has been ordered, and the example here is used from UPD. So try and identify which domain would this particular evidence fall into and which competency you would use. So take some time, pause the presentation and have a look as to which area it would cover, which domain. The domain that would be ideal here would be 3.2, which is supply chain management. And the evidence aligns to behavioral statement E, which is procuring medicines and medical devices in line with approved procurement or supply chain management policies and procedures appropriate to the practice setting. So in terms of annotation, you would have to explain to the assessor or the moderator exactly what this piece of evidence is referring to. So if you look at the evidence, the very first rectangular block, it says, I checked the medicine against the parcel received for quantity, strength, dosage form, and pack size, and found it all to be in order. The second block says, I checked the name on the invoice to ensure that the parcel is indeed for our pharmacy and that the medicine is charged to the correct pharmacy. The third block on the top, I checked the batch number and expiry date against the medicine received. The medicine was received in good order and the invoice captured and the medicine packed on the shelves according to the FIFO system. So this is an example of a detailed annotation where it tells the story of what was done, check the batch number against the medicine received. So it's not just purely a labeling exercise, but provides detailed information. So try and see how you could figure out which of these statements are linked to the behavioral statements within your domain and the competency that you've selected. So going into the details of evidence, in order to provide or in order to deem that particular evidence a full mark of 3, you must ensure that the evidence is current, it's valid, it's authentic, and it is sufficient. So what do we mean when we say current? The CPD entry must relate to the exposure to the competency standards during the internship period only, so you cannot provide evidence in the previous year. Evidence must therefore be collected during the internship. Don't include anything from your undergraduate years. Your evidence must be valid, so the evidence must pertain to that specific competency being addressed and the behavioral statements that is required. If factual or calculation errors occurred in the evidence will be deemed not valid. Remember, confidentiality is also an issue, so be careful to make sure that the patient name is blacked out. In terms of authenticity, this means that the evidence must be verified by your tutor, so the tutor signature, the P number as well, and the designation. You as the intern must also sign the evidence. Original documents must be authenticated. Don't simply attach pre-printed stickers of your tutor details. So make sure that the information is all current. Sufficiency is very important in terms of the 75% rule. So if there are more than 4 behavioral statements, and the evidence submitted must cover at least 75% of the behavioral statements. Make sure that you cover those 75% in order to deem yourself as obtaining the full 3 marks. Focus on the quality and not the quantity of the evidence, because often what you can do is use one piece of evidence that will cover 75% of the behavioral statements. You don't have to provide multiple evidence for different behavioral statements when you can find one piece of evidence that can cover majority of the behavioral statements. So important, you must have tutor authentication in terms of the P number, designation, signature, the name of the pharmacist, etc. All pieces of evidence must be described in terms of why did I include this in the text and annotations on the evidence in terms of your implementation. Very important also in your planning as well. Why did you use that? Tutor verification is very important. Make sure that it's your responsibility to check that the tutor has verified the entry and has submitted it. In terms of evidence and the types of evidence that you can submit photos, add the date stamp on that photo to make sure that it is current. It's meaningless if it doesn't have any annotation to it and capture to it as to why you are submitting that particular evidence. And make sure that you identify yourself. Can be anybody in the picture. In terms of pages from the SAMP, for example, or any of the resources, you must provide the reference name, the edition, the page number, and what does this actual page or copy of that page refers to in terms of where it falls into the implementation and how it relates to your behavioral statements. What does this show in terms of delivery notes? Make sure that you annotate as described in the previous example. Excuse me. The stock was delivered but received by whom? Signatures not annotated are quite meaningless to the assessor and the moderator. Remember to always put yourself in the assessor or the moderator's shoes. You can't expect them to understand why you put that particular evidence if you don't provide the annotation that goes with it and the explanation in the implementation. Please make sure that in terms of your evidence, you don't provide highly glossy photos. They're not loaded upside down. Put all the evidence into one document, and again, annotate. Very important that you provide reasons as to why you are providing that particular evidence. Link it to the behavioral statements and identify which portion of that evidence is you. Evidence for specific situations. Think about typical situations, what kind of evidence would be needed for that particular situation. And remember, this exercise is purely to get you thinking, and not all examples will be provided. So what kind of evidence? Just to give you an idea or to guide you as to what you should be thinking, or which line, in which direction you should be thinking. If you're providing information to a patient, ideally you would want to provide prescription as suitable evidence. If you're providing evidence to a group, here you would expect to see attendance register, presentation, reference materials used, feedback forms, even pictures, but remember to block out faces of the patient to prevent identifying those patients, and confidentiality issues as well. In terms of the providing information or evidence for a group of people, the attendance register is important, but it must identify the presenter name, the date, and the venue, and it should only be one presenter, not more than one. Feedback on the presentation should reflect knowledge and understanding of the audience after the presentation. So it must be a thorough feedback form to explain exactly what they've learned and what their understanding of that presentation was all about. If you're consulting with the patient history, so providing information of what information that you've recorded in terms of whether the patient is diabetic, hypertensive, age, weight, etc., the prescription that was required, the request from the patient, the blue copy, the label, and the reference material used when consulting with that patient. You can even refer to, for example, the GPP, where you could provide information on what a private consulting area should look like and all of the GPP requirements. Obviously linked to the behavioral statements. What if you consulting with a doctor, what information you would need? So the reason for the consultation, what triggered the reaction, the interaction between you and the doctor. You can provide the example of the script or maybe the anomaly, and the reference material that was used. References must be scientific, so you can't use Wikipedia as a resource. It must be annotated, and if you're including a page from a particular resource, make sure you annotate that page and explain how it is linked to your behavioral statement. Attending a meeting, what type of evidence you would provide here? Here you would give the agenda to the meeting, attendance register of the meeting, the minutes of the meeting, and importantly, what was your contribution to that particular meeting? So if you've attended the PTC, for example, how did you contribute to the PTC? Working with data, the reasons for the data collection. Is it, example, a screening report that was done, data analysis, looking at glucose patients, maybe adverse drug reactions? Why did you collect the data? How did you collect it? Provide an example of that data collection tool that you used. So in summary, if you look at all that has been covered in terms of the evidence forms a core component of the CPD cycle, as it tells the story or provides the picture to the assessor and the moderator to validate that you are actually competent within the CPD. So it is very important that you provide evidence that is relevant to that particular competency standard. So in order to be deemed competent for a CPD, your evidence is proof of what you actually did in order to show that you are competent in this particular CPD. You cannot show evidence that you are witnessing someone else, a theoretical scenario, for example, reading an article. So you must in essence convince the assessor and the moderator that you actually performed the activity. The evidence must be professional, it must be neat and clear, and not a note scribbled on a prescription, which is not ideal as it does not explain the story behind what you're trying to achieve in order to show competency. Very, very important is that you must convince the assessor that it was you that performed the activity. So in order to fulfill or be competent for the CPD, you must convince the assessor that the story that you're telling deems you to be competent. So what do you expect in terms of feedback from the assessors? The comments must be dated and will be dated by the assessors. The positive feedback would be acknowledgement of being on the right track and encouraging you to say to you that the CPD process that you're following is correct. Negative comments would be specific pointers with respect to what you did wrong and how you could improve, particularly in terms of evidence and annotation, where we find that majority of the problems in terms of the CPD cycle is actually the evidence and the poor or the lack of annotation. Guidelines for the next entries, even if attached to entry assessed as competent. So often what also happens is if the assessor finds that you are competent within that particular CPD, they do provide information as to guide you as to how to approach the next one. There may be fine details that you have missed in this CPD, which does not deem you as incompetent, but will make you competent, but you can work on in terms of your next CPD. So in terms of the assessment, it must be done and is marked on a scale of 0 to 3, as I've extensively mentioned to you in terms of the criteria, assessment for criteria on page 29 and 30. So to earn 3 marks, all requirements must be met, and that is a strict rule. You have to fulfill all of the requirements. In addition, you must use appropriate communication style, so it must be professional in terms of the way you execute your writing. So you have to make sure your spelling's correct, grammatical errors are removed, your sentences are properly punctuated, trade names are capitalized. And remember that the program is not set to have a built-in autocorrect as you would with Word, so make sure you double check your spelling. In terms of the scale, 0 to 3, you would see that 0 is not yet met, 1 or 2 is partially met, and 3 is fully met. So looking at the assessment of reflection, if, for example, you have a learning title that is absent or is simply a copy of the competency standard or outcome, you would get a 0. If there's no clear learning need identified, you would get a 0 as well. So in order to deem yourself as obtaining a 3, appropriate descriptive title linked to the outcome and clear learning need identified. In terms of the planning, if there's no planning at all, if there's a lack of resources, for example, and not linking it to the behavioral statements, you would get a 0. You would get a 3 if it includes what is planned and what the specific choices are being made as to why you're using that planning system or thought processes behind the planning. Appropriate primary learning channel is chosen. You would get a 3. Assessment of implementation, you would get a 0 if there's nothing there, absent or inappropriate. No supporting documentation or evidence in terms of your implementation is definitely a 0. The 3 would be you described in context the what, where, when, how process. Then you would obtain all 3 marks. What was done and what was learned, and makes reference to the attached evidence and links it to the behavioral statements. Very, very important that you link your evidence, you annotate it, and you link it to your behavioral statements. In terms of your evidence, where the evidence is insufficient, it's not valid, confidentiality is breached, authentication is absent or incomplete, all of that gives you a 0. A 3 is when the evidence is sufficient, it's current, it's valid, it's linked to the behavioral statements, it's appropriately annotated and properly authenticated, labeled correctly in terms of if you are providing a picture, provide a picture of who you and annotate who you are. You will obtain a 3. In terms of evaluation, you would get a 0 if it's completely inappropriate and only focusing on the implementation. In your evaluation should be deemed as obtaining a 3. You discuss what you've learned in terms of the impact, the subsequent application, providing examples, and what your future learning needs are and why. In terms of the reassessment, what is the reassessment process? You're allowed to resubmit for reassessment of your CPD entries. On resubmitting, fix an entry that is there. Don't allow a new one unless the assessor recommends this. If necessary, remove incorrect evidence. To minimize the need for resubmission, submit early and submit regularly on a monthly basis. See all of the guidelines that are provided in your manual and on the Pharmacy Council website on the conditions, the application procedure, and the timelines that are required. To prevent the need for resubmission, make sure to follow all of the assessors and all the moderators' recommendations. Resubmitted CPD entries are sent to the same assessor. Don't simply resubmit without attending to the reasons for the entry being deemed not yet competent. You are allowed to submit 9 CPD entries, that is 6 plus 50% of the resubmissions. A fee is levied if 10 or more entries are submitted. Plagiarism in terms of professionalism is very important. We often find that interns are plagiarizing other people's work, so be very careful of that. Obviously, your CPD entries must reflect your own work. Any irregularities will be referred to the SAPC legal department and action will be taken. You will experience penalties and expect them to be applied and to be severe. Remember that CPD submissions are not just another hurdle in terms of your pharmacy career. It's actually an opportunity for you to develop your professionalism. Confidentiality has to be maintained at all times. So you must make sure that all information of the patient has been deleted or blocked out. Example, Schedule 6 registers, trader labels, prescriptions, even pictures as well. Automatically, if confidentiality has been breached, the CPD will be deemed not yet competent. Remember that confidentiality only applies to patients and not doctors, hospitals, or other facilities. So in terms of the role of your tutor is there to guide you and to assist you through this entire process of the CPD in your internship year. They are role models, meaning that they have an obligation to be competent and to practice professionally themselves. They are also seen as mentors, where they have an opportunity for self-development through training and can use their CPD, use this experience of tutoring as a CPD entry. Remember that tutors have to fulfill at least 4 CPD online entries before they become registered as a tutor, and all pharmacists must now submit CPDs. Tutor authentication, the best in terms of a descriptive note, not just a generic statement, so it must be detailed, it must provide the essence of what the CPD is all about. Make sure all of the elements of the authentication process are present. So the intern completes it, the tutor must verify it online, either accept it or not, and this will be released to Pharmacy Council. If the tutor does not accept the CPD, they must be able to explain to the intern how to improve it and then verify and release. And an example of that is provided. So the role of the tutor is ultimately to guide the intern and ensure that they complete their internship based on the requirements by the South African Pharmacy Council. They must be able to familiarize themselves with the entire internship process and to be able to complete all of the reports timeously. They have a very important role in terms of ensuring the success of their intern by ensuring that they are competent, providing guidance, they are very interactive, empathetic, supportive, and encouraging. So finally, I want to leave you with this particular slide, which says in terms of being or achieving or completing the CPDs through your year in your internship in 2020, just remember that this process is an opportunity for you to become a true lifelong learner, where you learn, experience, develop, and succeed to become a pharmacist that provides information to their patients and changes the way people view pharmacists, to be individuals that they can approach in terms of any healthcare requirement. Thank you. All the best for your internship year 2020.